From 1958 to 1964, in an effort to support Tibetans' freedom fighters, the CIA operated a secret training facility nicknamed Dumra, the Garden at Camp Hale. Until very recently, the exact location of the training facility had been lost to history. Now, anthropologist and scholar of Tibet, Dr. Carole McGranahan, together with retired CIA agent Bruce Walker, who trained the Tibetan fighters at Camp Hale, have located Dumra. Dr. McGranahan is a professor and chair of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Colorado in Boulder, who has dedicated the entirety of her research career to the Tibetan community. Bruce Walker joined the CIA following his service in the Marine Corps and was the only CIA agent at Camp Hale who could speak and read the Tibetan language. He created an archive of project materials at the Hoover Institution Library at Stanford University. Joining Dr. McGranahan and Bruce Walker tonight to tell this story are Indian-Tibetan filmmakers and artists Ritu Saran and Tenzing Sonam, who have been researching this story for many years using archival material from Tenzing's father, Lamutin Sering, who was a leader in the Tibetan resistance and a liaison between the Tibetans and CIA. Ritu and Tenzing will be sharing clips with us from their documentary, The Shadow Circus, the CIA in Tibet. They also have brought books with them from India and that also share that same story, available for sale after the event. They are the directors and founders of the Dharamshala International Film Festival and have made several award-winning documentary films that they share, including at the One World Film Festival in Prague and the Toronto International Film Festival. Please join me in welcoming Carole McGranahan, Bruce Walker, Ritu Saran, and Tenzing Sonam.
Thank you so much. Thank you, James, Megan, Kevin, Michael, everyone at Vail Symposium for inviting us to come here and share our story with you. Before I get started, though, I want to acknowledge actually some very special guests we have who've driven up from Boulder, but actually have come from much farther than Boulder. So this weekend, we are also doing an event at Camp Hale, and so we have guests who have flown in from India. We have guests coming from Canada. We have guests who've come from LA, from Boston, New York, Washington, DC, Santa Fe. And two very special men are a member of the contingent that you see here sitting to my right. So I want to formally acknowledge the presence and offer my respect and gratitude to Ken Rinpoche Losang Sepe, who is here with us today, who has come from LA. Ken Rinpoche is originally from Litang, Tibet. He was a member of the Chushigandru Resistance Army that we're going to be telling you about tonight, and he was also the abbot of Ganden Monastery, which is one of the three main Gelugpa monasteries in Tibet. So Kushala, it's very, Kempala, an honor to have you here with us. I also want to introduce you to Mr. Pema Chinjor, who is here with us tonight as well, who was also a member of the Chushigandru Resistance Army that we're going to be telling you about, and was also an elected member of the Tibetan Exile Parliament in Dharamsala, India. So, Genla, thank you also for being here today. All right, and to everyone else, Vail Valley residents, folks who are here from out of town, our special guests, thank you so much. I'm now going to go to the lectern and start the more formal part of my presentation. I want to also say it's an honor to be here with Bruce and with Tenzing and Ritu. So we've all known each other since the 90s. Tenzing and Ritu have known Bruce since the 1980s. Bruce has known Tenzing's father since the 1950s. At lunch today, I learned that Bruce and Tenzing shared Christmas dinner together in 1962. However, we've never presented together. Usually when we present the history of the Tibetan resistance, we do so alone. And so we're here today actually not just to do a joint presentation, we are also planning to write a book. So you are our first audience. There are also many people tuning in online from around the world, again, including from India. So we look forward to your feedback, your comments, your questions. Okay. So what we're going to do today is share the still mostly unknown history of Camp Hale. And so for 5 years, so 1958 was the planning organizing year. The camp launched in 1959 and ran through October of 1964. And several hundred Tibetan resistance soldiers were trained there by CIA officers, including Bruce Walker. These Tibetan men were part of a citizens' army that was formed to fight against the Chinese People's Liberation Army. Oh, I didn't realize the slides weren't going. This is Camp Hale. But more specifically, this is Dumra, the garden. Okay, now let me. Okay, so the Tibetan men, again, were part of a citizens' army who were fighting against the Communist Chinese People's Liberation Army in order to defend Tibet. Next slide. Defend the Dalai Lama. Next slide, please. And here is a map of Tibet. Because they were fighting Communist China, and this was during the Cold War, one country in particular was interested, and it was the USA. So the USA, through the Department of State and the CIA, ended up helping Tibetans. To be fair, Tibetans reached out to them and were looking, right, for support from different governments around the world. So the training camp that we're going to share with you today was one component of the CIA Tibet operation. It was not the only one. And it was one of a small part, actually, of a much longer Tibetan resistance to China. For those who participated in it, just give me a second.
Okay. Sorry.
No, okay, are you good? Okay. So we have 3 individuals in this room who participated in it, right? Mr. Bruce?
Say again.
We have 3 individuals here who participated in the Tibetan resistance.
Okay.
And you are one of them.
Okay.
Kempala and Gela. So I want to say, for these men, but for the thousands others, it was one of the most meaningful, or the most meaningful experiences in their lives. Yes, there's 2 men from Chushigandru who are here in the front row.
Were in the resistance forces and
Yes.
fought the communists?
Yes, they did.
Hallelujah.
Yes. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So of the thousands of Tibetan soldiers, we believe that a little under 300 trained at Dumra, and here you can see the actual compound. 33 Americans were stationed there with them. The CIA code name for the compound was the Ranch. But as Megan's already shared with you, and as is the title of this event, the Tibetans codenamed it Dumra, which means the garden. The men were there year-round through the different seasons. Next slide, please. Holidays, next slide. This is celebrating Tibetan Losar, or Tibetan New Year. And downtime. Can we have the next slide?
There's Bill Smith.
Their camp,
No.
we'll talk, yeah, when we come,
Okay.
we'll do Bill Smith when we come to that part. Their camp was hidden from the world. Next slide, please. A large fence built around it to prevent folks from seeing what or who was inside. Okay, next slide, please. And next slide. And one more. Okay, and the next one. Thank you. So this is a history of Tibet, of China, of the United States during after the Cold War, but also of Colorado, right? Including, for those of you who are resident up here, of history right in your own backyard. And as Bruce has already shared, we're actually very curious to find out who here might have connections to Camp Hale, to the 10th Mountain Division. Maybe you were just up hiking and discovered something that was a little curious and you're not sure what it is, or maybe you have stories to share with us. We would love to hear them. There are still some mysteries of the CIA Tibetan operation right here in Colorado that we're trying to solve. Okay. So together, the 4 of us are part of a small community of scholars, writers, and participants who are involved in documenting the Tibetan resistance to China, including, but not only, the CIA's participation. And most of the individuals who participated in this, are not with us any longer. Right? So we're no longer in the time of actively collecting oral histories. We're still trying to do that work, but we're now looking to other sources as well. But the people we're talking about today are people we know personally. So every single individual whose photo you are going to see is someone that one of the 4 of us knows or knew personally, or someone that perhaps all 4 of us knew. And I think it's important to share that this isn't just a history of governments or geopolitics, but it's a lived history, right, of actual people who we knew, who were family members, and about whom we cared and cared deeply. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, one more. This is the bedroom of Ray Stark, who was one of the CIA officers. He was the radio trainer. You'll hear more about him from Bruce. Next slide, please. Most of the men involved in this, and I'm saying men particularly, there was a very small number of women involved, we'll come to one of those, were ordinary people, just regular people living their lives when China invaded and all of a sudden had to stop what they were doing to defend their families, right, to defend their leaders. On the left is Losang Tinli. He's Li Tangba. He was a monk at Sera Monastery who disrobed to join the resistance to fight to defend the Dalai Lama and Buddhism. I think my thing's falling off. He's the father of the Tibetan family I've stayed with since 1994. On his right, his left, our right, is Lobsang Jampa. He trained at Camp Hale and was one of the shining stars of the trainees. Bruce, this is Saul on the right.
Okay.
All of the Tibetan trainees were given American code names. So Saul trained there, Eddie, Adam, Clay, Clifton. There was a Bruce. Bruce wasn't the only Bruce. Next slide, please. Women were involved in the resistance up until a certain point. So at first, fighting from their homes in Tibet, women and men both fought. Later, when the army was formalized and was devoted and kind of dedicated to the Dalai Lama officially, it was no longer appropriate for women to fight. But the woman you see here on the screen, her name is Dorje Yudun. She is from the Jaritsang family of Nyaron. She recently passed away. She fiercely led troops into battle, not necessarily because she wanted to, but because she had to. One of her sons, Gyari Rinpoche, was the Dalai Lama's second in command, his special envoy in the world for many decades. And one of her daughters was the first elected woman to be Speaker of the Tibetan Parliament. She is currently in the Dalai Lama's cabinet. She's the Minister of Security, and she will be arriving tomorrow. So she will be here for our ceremony on Sunday. Next slide, please. Okay. This is the flag of Chushi Gandru, the army. And so we are having our ceremony on Sunday, which is 1 week in advance of its founding on June 16th, which formally took place in 1958. So the 66th anniversary is this year. And the history of the Tibetan resistance has an uneasy place in Tibetan national history. And it might surprise you to learn that it's actually not that well known, not just by Americans, but even by Tibetans. Next slide, please. So one of the things I found in my research was that this history is arrested, and that basically in exile, it was deemed a bit too difficult, dangerous, controversial to really tell. So the history has been arrested or postponed until a time in the future when certain things, unity, autonomy, independence, are secured, and it's safe to tell this history. One reason, of course, that it's not told is the connection to the CIA, which was certainly a top secret mission. But that's not the only one, right? They also didn't win the war, although there are many instances where, failures in the battlefield, don't necessarily end up in not telling a story. Another is that Tibet has a politics of nonviolence. And if you have a politics of nonviolence, it's very difficult to narrate a history of war. But mostly it had to do with internal politics and with things within the exile community and what it means to maintain cohesion and unity when you've become refugees and had to recreate your government in exile. So the arrest of history, however, is not indefinite. It involves a release. And we are now in the gradual time of release. Next slide, please. So there are a number of books that have been written about the resistance, including by me, including by Tenzing and Ritu. Next slide, please. The ones before were in English. There's also a number of books that have been written in Tibetan. On the screen here, you see a gentleman named Ratu Ngawang and books that he wrote. Next slide, please. Here you see an 8-volume series of books written in Tibetan by Tenzing's father, Drungit Lamotsereng. Next slide, please. There's also a documentary film about the resistance that Tenzing and Ritu made that came out in the late 90s. Next slide. There's a feature film that's currently being made by a next generation, kind of a descendant member of the family that is coming soon, although we don't exactly know when. Next slide. Actually, can we go back to that last slide for a second? The title of this film is 4 Rivers, 6 Ranges, which is the translation of Chushi Gandru, which is the name of the army, which is a historical name for the eastern Tibet province of Kham. So that's why the film has that title. Next slide, please. Museum exhibits. Again, this one curated by Tenzing and Ritu with Natasha Jinwala. Next slide. The Tibet Museum in Dharamsala, after many years of not really including the resistance, now has a permanent exhibit on the resistance. If you go to Dharamsala, which is where the Dalai Lama's government is based, it will be included. Next slide. There's even a rap video that has been made about the resistance. And this rap video actually was made after a young Tibetan read my book when it came out. And at the time, my two children were ages 6 and 10, and I can tell you there is nothing cooler. Like when your mom's book inspires someone to make a rap video. As a mom, I got a lot of cred. So on YouTube, if you want to check out the rap video. Next slide, please. And then, at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, which is an archive dedicated to the Cold War, are the Bruce Walker Papers. So Bruce was not just someone who was involved when he was a CIA officer in training Tibetans, but then made it part of his life to collect everything he could, all documents related to both Camp Hale, but also other aspects of the Tibetan CIA operation, but also the Tibetan resistance in general. I'm going to show you a couple photos from the archives from a trip that he and I just did in April. Next slide, please. Here we are at his house going through a series of materials that was going to be his next donation to the archive. Next slide, please. Here he is explaining something to me, telling me what it is. Next slide. Here we are in the archive in Hoover. This is a painting that Bruce commissioned from a CIA-approved military artist depicting a mission into Tibet. Next slide. Here I am with a local Vail Valley resident looking over some of Bruce's collection. And I can tell you, being in there, it's one thing I go into the archives all the time and just look at the things that are in the collection. Being in the archive with Bruce and having him tell us, right, what the things are that we're holding, that we're looking at while wearing the special gloves is very meaningful. Next slide. What we're looking at here is a photo Bruce staged himself during the election season in 64 or 62, Bruce?
64.
Thank you, 64. Right, so it's one thing for me to try and interpret the photo. It's another for Bruce to tell me he put the magazines in the hands of these gentlemen, right? And had conversations and laughter with them while they were doing so, talking about world history. Next slide. Okay. Also a big deal, in 2010 we had a ceremony at Camp Hale to install a plaque. And I want to say this does not ever happen. The CIA does not publicly acknowledge, right, their missions, their operations. So this was installed through the hard work of several of Bruce's colleagues, especially Roger McCarthy and Ken Knaus, working in concert with former US Senator Mark Udall. So a plaque was installed at Camp Hale. Next slide. These are some photos from the ceremony. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. I'll pause here for 1 second. These are two of the retired CIA officers who trained there. This is Ray Stark and Ken Knaus, and I spent a lot of time with them doing interviews. This is what they looked like when I knew them, but I want to show you now who they were back in 1962. Next slide. This is Ray Stark, who was driving around up here in the winter in his MG. Next slide, please. Probably speeding over 40 coming into Leadville. Okay, next slide, please. And going pretty far and wide, right? So the Tibetans were limited to the camp or to anywhere only that the CIA brought them. But some of the CIA officers were out and about, including, I've been told, trips down to Glenwood Springs to try and meet girls. So these are some of the stories we're looking for if you have like grandparents or aunts and uncles who remember this. Next slide, please. This is Ken Knaus on the right, and this, we're thinking, Tracy Walters has suggested, might be at either Jackal or Vance Hut. So this is one of the things we're like, we don't know. Do any of you know? Next slide, please. Do you recognize where he is? Right, like, help us find this. Okay, next slide. And then here they are again. So Ray on the left, the one with the MG, Ken on the right, who was the one at the hut. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, next slide. A bunch of speeches were made. Next slide, please. And next slide. Okay. So at the end of the ceremony to install the plaque, there were a bunch of the retired CIA officers and Tibetan veterans who were there, got in their rental cars, and went to find the actual site where the camp was. They wanted to go see the place where they had lived together for so long. They couldn't find it, which was like shock to the rest of us. I was like, what do you mean you can't find it? You lived there, for years on end. But they couldn't find it. And this was a source of great distress and concern to them. So we're trying to figure out why. Why couldn't they find it? One of the reasons was they had a map where it was marked in the wrong location. So that was a problem. Okay. Next slide, please. Also, they were a bit turned around. The CIA and the Tibetan trainees always came in on the road from Climax. They didn't come in on 24. So they accessed the camp through a route different from the way that you access it today. They also had created a bit of a mythos around where the camp was. I'd been told numerous times by retired officers that, it's 4 valleys back. It's not visible from the road. You have things like that in my mind, and I think in the mind of other people, put it in a location that actually is absolutely not where it is, which is entirely visible from Route 24. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. However, because we couldn't find the site, right, so I wanted to find it, but I wasn't sure how, the plaque became a pilgrimage site unto its own. So whenever Tibetans from around the world, around the United States, come to Colorado, they come now to Camp Hale. It is a pilgrimage site in the Tibetan community. And come here. The plaque is in the middle. You can't quite see it. It's quite small. Next slide, please. You can see we're zooming in now. You can see it now there. It's small behind the picnic tables. Next slide. And now there is an interpretive sign here that this is a map of basically 10th Mountain Division. Next slide. But for the first time, the Forest Service has put some information about Tibet. This just went up during the pandemic, I believe. And it says, Central Intelligence Agency secretly trains Tibetan soldiers at Camp Hale for incursions into China from 1959 to 1965. Not totally accurate, but it's okay. I will accept that. Bruce will accept it. I'm sure these guys will too, right? It's now public. Can we go back one, please? But the site of the camp, and this is an incredibly detailed map of the 10th Mountain Division. Like it's all the way down to, here's where the veterinary infirmary was. The CIA Tibetan camp isn't listed, right? The site isn't known. No one knows where it is. Okay, next slide, and then the next. Okay, so here, what I want to point out to you, if you go up here and you see a white scarf hanging, that is actually a Tibetan prayer scarf. Okay, so this is when you go on pilgrimage and you come to a sacred spot. When you come to a spot where something important, poignant has happened, you offer a prayer scarf. Next slide. You can see one here tied to the railing behind the plaque. Next slide. When I was there recently, and this was Memorial Day weekend, I noticed that actually in this grove of aspens, memorials had also been added. Next slide, please. So people have started carving on the trees. Next slide. At the top, on the top right, that is the Tibetan script, Pu, which is the word for Tibet. You can see under it, it says Free Tibet, and down on the right, China out of Tibet. Next slide, please. Here we have Tibetan writing, Tibet, the word for Tibet on the bottom again. Next slide. And lots of memorial things, including to CIA officers. So the one at the bottom, R.I.P. Tony Poe. Tony Poe was one of the most renowned and beloved CIA teachers among the Tibetans. Okay. So this is where people go. Next slide. Here we see Tenzin Sundu on the left, one of the leading Tibetan activists in the world, was here in Colorado 1 year ago, out here with a Tibetan flag, right, going to the site on pilgrimage. Next slide, please. Losang Sangye, the first democratically elected president in the Tibetan community, also making a pilgrimage here. Next slide. With the Tibetan flag, with prayer flags. Next slide. Continuing with a picnic. Next slide. And continuing with a religious ceremony, offerings of juniper boughs as incense and of sampa, right? So a religious kind of way to activate and consecrate the site. Okay. But they are so close, yet not at the right place. So I really wanted to find the site, but I didn't know how to do it. Next slide, please. So then I met someone from Vail who told me he spent a lot of time at Camp Hale, and I thought, well, maybe you would know someone who would know. So I sent Tracy Walters, who's sitting up here, 2 photos from the site and said, do you recognize them? And he recognized a landscape feature. We snowshoed out in February after he kind of triangulated old photos, contemporary maps, and satellite imagery, and went up on snowshoes on a very cold, snowy day to figure out if we could find the place. Next slide, please. We printed out the photographs. So here I am holding, next slide, this photograph that you've already seen, right? Holding this and trying to match it up to the land. Next slide. Next slide. This was the hardest one to get. That's that Losar photo we showed you before, the New Year photo, and we found it. Next slide. I wrote to Bruce and Tenzing and Ritu and said, we went out to Camp Hale today. We think we found the site. Here are the photos. Bruce wrote back, you nailed it. But then he also included, and I'm the one who took the photos you're holding up, right? Which I hadn't known. Okay, next photo, please. Okay. If you go to Camp Hale now and look for Dumra, you mostly won't find it, which is why I haven't found it for 20-something years, because this is what it looks like. It doesn't necessarily look like anything's there or was there. Next slide, please. This is a photo taken at the demolition of the camp in 1973 when it was finally torn down. That little pine tree right there. We figure when the camp actually closed in 1964 must have been a sapling. Next slide. It is still there. It's that tree right in the foreground. And now you know where the site is, if you know where you can find that. So that one tree, right, is kind of our living marker that's still there. And its progress, right, its growth is visible. So this is the exact site where we are going to be gathering on Sunday, kind of to honor the Tibetan community, to honor those Americans who joined with them, kind of in the fight for Tibet. Before I pass the baton here to Bruce Walker, I want to invite up my partner. So I have organized the Sunday event from the University of Colorado in partnership with the Tibetan community in Colorado, especially Chushigandro. And my partner, Mr. Kuncho Tenzin, is here and would like to offer some katas. Kuncho, where are you? No, I don't. Lots. And now you come to the stage.
What, it's me?
It's you. Go ahead. James.
Okay. Thank you so much. Oh, bless your heart. Thank you. Well, I'm overcome by this gracious gesture of gifts, which are exceedingly beautiful and which I will remember for the rest of my life, as well as being here for this weekend. I want to thank Carole for her heroic innovation, her determination, and her enterprise and hard work. Where are you, Carole? Oh, you're upstairs. She's on upstairs. Carole, bless your heart. I want to thank you for everything you did, the hard work and the bright ideas. Thank you very much. I also want to thank the Vail Symposium group, Dale, Megan, and James especially, for organizing this weekend program and for inviting us and for the fine accommodations. Thank you very much for all of that, all of you. I am pleased to be back in Vail for this event. Since 1962, I have skied Vail many times. Living in Denver with my wife, we skied Vail. Living in San Francisco, we made the trip flying into Eagle Vail. In February 2007, I broke my arm falling on ice coming down Lion's Head. But my best memory, however, is breezing down the slopes of Vail, especially Swingsville, for the first time. Working at Camp Hale, I recall it was in the second week of December 1962. The official opening date of record is December 15. So the owners must have allowed skiers from Camp Hale to give the slopes an early tryout. I became an intermediate skier at Vail, and I'm grateful for that. I want to make a clarification. I was not a CIA agent. I never was a CIA agent. The term CIA agent is what would be called now, I think, a meme, although I don't use memes. It's a buzzword in today's culture. Employees of the CIA workforce are not identified as agents. Those of us who were in the CIA's clandestine services division, and that's a true and spooky word, we were called case officers, as one of the documents from the where the hell was it?
Hoover Library.
It was down in Stanford at the Hoover Institution, where I was properly referred to as a case officer. I was a CIA case officer, kind of like doing different grunt work and different assignments. Some case officers spot, recruit, and handle agents to do the official spy work. The CIA's Tibetan project merged elements of case officer intelligence work plus paramilitary activity. After my agency JOT training in 1956, I spent 3 years under State Department cover as a case officer in Guayaquil, Bogota, and San Pedro Sula. These were not exciting posts. Having minored in Spanish at college, I figured that must have been appropriate first assignments for me, But late in 1959, I was interested in a transfer to China operations. And so it happened I was interviewed by Roger McCarthy. Photo? There's Roger, one of my best friends for the rest of his life. He was the project manager of the agency's Tibetan Resistance Project, codenamed ST Circus. Roger was looking for a case officer who would join the project to learn and use the Tibetan language, there being none in the agency at that time. This was an unusual opportunity for me to get out of South America. While I didn't know much about Tibet, when he hired me, I decided it would be a challenging career to learn the language and participate in the project. I started in January 1960, arriving in Camp Hale in April and spending the summer there with interpreters, beginning to give basic instruction in subjects such as using a compass to follow a compass course around the Camp Hale secure area, learning how to read special CIA-made Tibetan cloth maps, photo, in order to plot coordinates related to activity inside of Tibet, plus instruction using observation techniques, how to use a camera, the essentials of reports writing, tradecraft techniques on transportation targets, for example, all of which became part of the training syllabus at Camp Hale. The agency arranged for me to spend an academic year, 1960-61, under student cover at the University of Washington in Seattle, which in September 1960 inaugurated its new Tibetan program, having invited a Sakyapa family to come from India as resident linguistic informants for the language staff. There were two professors, Terry Wiley, who was fluent in Tibetan, and the eminent Hugh Richardson, who had spent a decade before 1950 as the British diplomat in Lhasa. He came from London to join the UW project, teaching Western history and culture. There was no one better to do that work. Completing the academic year's course with all A grades, I returned to Camp Hale for the summer of 1961 to begin work as the Tibetan language officer. Roger suggested I should study the language further. With Hugh Richardson's help in 1962, I obtained Indian government approval as a student to visit the inner line area called Sikkim. I wrote the head of the Namgyal Institute of Tibetology in Gangtok, Sikkim, again using student cover, soliciting further spoken and written study with the resident monks. I was accepted, paying no fee, but in exchange for giving daily English lessons to local young Tibetan men for whom spoken English would be an asset. I began in March 1962 and completed a 6-month program in September. Returning to Washington wearing a red beard, I grew a red beard till I looked like I was an adventurous young American who didn't have anything better to do but to go to Sikkim and grow a beard. I went back to Camp Hale, where the compound, now renovated, with added trainee living quarters and the new gym, opened its doors to the fourth and final contingent of trainees who arrived in October. The primary object of Camp Hale was to train radio operators in the use of high-speed radio equipment with which they would be parachuted into Tibet to hook up with soldiers fighting the Chinese in Kham, the area of Kham in eastern Tibet. The same teams were tasked to obtain information about the Khamba forces and also the strength and positions of the PLA. It was anticipated that the radio teams would make contact with freedom-fighting citizens who would help to establish a wide resistance campaign throughout the country. With this kind of intelligence, the radio teams would prepare coded radio message to transmit to CIA headquarters. Those not selected for radio training were given classwork instruction in all other areas to support the teams, and ultimately they joined resistance forces in Nepal. All were given training with the M1 Garand rifle in the old 10th Mountain Division rifle range. Two Marine sharpshooters were seconded to the project for this purpose, and they also gave the Tibetans instruction in self-defense and jiu-jitsu. The first radio team, number A, is letter A. Tom and Lou, famous fellows, were trained in Saipan by Roger and airdropped in Kham in September 1957. After contacting local Chushigongdru fighters in Kham, the two men were able to reach Lhasa and make contact with Tibetan leaders, such as the Lord Chamberlain Thupten Pala. It was Pala who organized the Dalai Lama's escape in February 1959. Team A accompanied the Dalai Lama on his journey to the Indian border, where they radioed CIA Langley that the Dalai Lama had arrived safely. They asked the Dalai Lama to have the State Department solicit approval from Prime Minister Nehru for the Dalai Lama to take refuge in India. And that was an important connection for the CIA to make. In 1960, part of the training was to practice parachute landing in advance of being airdropped in Tibet. This was called a PLF, parachute landing fall. This required construction of an open wooden platform a few feet off the ground, from which were hung harnesses with detachable, stretchable shoulder straps. The platform was built by CIA parachute dispatch officers, PDOs we call them, who managed the training. The technique was to make a short jump from the platform to the ground below, pointing your toes toward the ground as your body curved at the knees to roll approaching the ground, when the straps would halt or break the fall. Finally, in summer 1960, actual jumps for the radio teams were made in early morning darkness at Peterson Field near Fort Carson in Colorado Springs. From a C-47, each trainee would jump from 1,500 feet, aiming with his harness to a dimly lighted drop zone where a reception party was waiting. This low altitude was determined to allow the fastest distance to the ground to avoid being detected by the enemy. American staff also did the PLFs at Camp Hale. The Americans joined them at Peat Field, hooked up in between them, going out the door. In a single morning of darkness, aboard 10 different C-47 passes over the drop zone, the CIA staff, including me, made a series of 10 jumps. Been there, done that. At the beginning of the Camp Hale project, a small clinic with a professional CIA EMT was available around the clock inside the compound. The agency arranged for the Army's hospital at Fort Carson to receive and care for Tibetans in case of medical emergencies. This involved making covert arrivals into a small isolation ward staffed with cleared Army doctors and nurses. I recall one case in the summer of 1960 when a trainee who was practicing PLFs happened to fall the wrong way, hitting his head on a metal part of the harness. He was bleeding profusely from a gash in his forehead. The agency medic gave him first aid before he was loaded into a station wagon and taken for treatment at the hospital at Fort Carson. He arrived with a deep scar on his forehead, which ended his parachute career. However, after Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Russia in May 1960, President Eisenhower banned further overflights into Tibet. Thereafter, the radio teams and the support teams were flown back to Thailand and overland to border posts in India and Nepal, including Mustang. In 1964, the exchange of radio messages with the radio teams was transferred from Langley, CIA Langley, through a secret joint operations center in New Delhi, staffed by CIA, Tibetan, and Indian service representatives. In 1966-68, I was posted to the American Embassy as a Foreign Service officer and became the CIA representative at the JOC. This was during the period of migration to Mustang. I must add that one of my colleagues at the JOC for those 2 years was Lhamo Tsering, who is the father of my good friend Tenzing Sonam. A lovable, wonderful man. Lama Tsering was the true leader, on hand, in front leader of the Tibetan Resistance Movement that the CIA was involved with. You'll hear more about Tenzing's dad. One summer day in 1960, Roger McCarthy arranged for a transport plane with PDOs aboard to make a low-flying pass over the wide open space in front of the compound. I watched the demonstration of parachutes being offloaded with streams of empty bundles, being a vivid demonstration for the Tibetans of what an overflight would look like. No doubt it was a dramatic stunt, which was a thrill for the Tibetans to see. In addition to classroom instruction, I shared with the other instructors the daily assignment to lead afternoon calisthenics in the big gym. In winter weather, the heated gym was wonderful for exercise. The most popular kind of exercise was volleyball. The Tibetans had a natural gift for the game, perfecting the moves, dividing into teams, and holding rousing, highly competitive tournaments with cheering crowds watching. This was certainly high spirits at 10,000 feet. Less energetic but no enthusiastic was daily use of the ping pong table in the recreation building. Even I could compete with the Tibetans, and it was fun for us to share the game with them. In the recreation room, movies were projected after dinner. Headquarters would send us a rotation of movies to show. The Tibetans specifically liked Western movies and developed a special fondness for a movie in particular, which we would keep and repeat. The movie was The King and I. I believe there was a combination of exotic Thai culture and the parade of cute children which captivated them. Their response was pure delight to watch the movie. The CIA cooks, Joe and Bill, performed remarkable work to feed 3 meals a day to the trainees and sometimes 10 or more Americans. The Tibetans had hearty appetites for American chow. On Saturday nights, the kitchen was turned over to them. Using groceries ordered through the cooks, Joe and Bill, Tibetan chefs prepared a Tibetan menu for everyone. Using groceries ordered through Joe and Bill, Tibetan chefs prepared a Tibetan menu for everyone, filled with rice, vegetables, momos, and shop hollies. And there were kegs of beer on Saturday night to be shared by Tibetans and Americans alike. But we never offered any liquor for the Tibetans at any time during the time they were at Camp Hale. Materials of drawing paper with colored pens and pencils were made available for leisure time. It became apparent from the first group at Camp Hale that some trainees enjoyed primitive drawing. A few of them showed remarkable talent and painted pictures which became collectible art. One artist in particular drew illustrations of Chinese political action political action themes of Chinese desecration used in CIA Tibetan propaganda pamphlets. Here is one which I saved and kept, depicting Chinese desecration of Tibetan culture and religion. You've got a photo up there? It was used for the cover of Carole's book, Arrested Histories. That was a great feat to get it on the book of a cover which could be sold in bookstores. In summer 1964, American staff began to give lectures about world leaders, world history, and current world events, Berlin Wall U.S. presidential campaigns. The Tibetans were enthusiastic listeners to different lecture subjects after 2 years of repeated instruction. As a break in the 1964 summer routine at the compound, it was decided to create an R&R opportunities for groups of trainees on rotation who were trucked out of the site going west on the Eagle River Road. You've seen that road, leading into a secluded valley in a secure area. There they set up tents and a cooking area. Food supplies were brought from the compound, and during the daytime, in a makeshift amphitheater, some of the star students began to deliver lectures to the others, refreshing from memory all the lectures. Well, I screwed that up. All the lectures they had heard given by the Americans in the preceding 3 years. Okay. They had been given before. Okay. Some enterprising architects and builders showed talent cutting down aspen trees, shaping them into logs, and constructing this good-looking cabin for fun. A picnic was held to inaugurate the cabin, and it was happily used for at least 3 or 4 weeks. As the decision was made to return the last contingent of trainees overland to India in October 1964, the American staff prepared each person with a departure kit of clothing and personal effects, obviously without traces of U.S. origin and without weapons. It was necessary to remove some small knives they had acquired and other paraphernalia which bore USA markings. After they had left Camp Hale, a small group of instructors remained to pack whatever classified material needed to be shipped to Washington. It was necessary to police all buildings and grounds to find and dispose of written materials and physical objects that were recognizably in a strange foreign language. It could have been anywhere around Camp Hale. CIA's Camp Hale was closed in 1964 after we moved out. CIA's Camp Hale was closed in October 1964. In 1965, Camp Hale was dismantled and the land was deeded to the U.S. Foreign Service. Several dozen photos which trainees had taken during photography exercises were developed by me in the darkroom and then pinned to the walls of the rec room for all to enjoy. At the end, all of them were destroyed. That was photo history that could not be saved. But I regret to this day that I left the photos in a burning trash bin. Of anecdotes to end with, I recall one. A sheepherder, I was there. A sheepherder, I believe, from the Pando area, had a long-standing agreement with the army for him to traverse Camp Hale with his flock of sheep, leading them to summer pasture land near the climax gate. There he would leave the sheep for perhaps a month or more. He would return to round up the sheep and reverse the drive back to Pando. His route happened to go directly past the Tibetan compound. Not wanting to cause suspicion by denying the shepherd his annual drive, we arranged for the compound to close up tightly, presumably with everyone inside the compound and out of sight. Upon his return, having led his herd past the compound and out of Camp Hale, the herder soon counted his sheep and found he was missing one. He reported his loss to army authorities, and the situation was brought to our attention. We had no recourse but to suggest that the sheep must have drifted from the herd, gone astray, and could not be found. Somehow it turned out 2 Tibetans had waylaid the sheep, had slaughtered it, and later brought it into the compound where they roasted it for their fellow Tibetans. The herder was angry and unsatisfied, but as far as I was concerned, it was out of sight, out of mind. There was a second anecdote. I was not at Camp Hale when this took place. My only available source is Bob Winsett, the estimable journalist for the Vail Daily, who was listening to this streaming event on a secret wire in Frisco. Hello, Bob. I'm sorry you can't be here today, and I hope your knee gets better. My only available source is his article, which he wrote for the Vail Daily, April 15, 2008. The title is, and I quote, "Eagle County, Tibetans Build Camp Hale Missile," unquote. It is short, and I am reading the entire passage. Quote, "The CIA operatives assigned to Camp Hale held only the highest regard for the Tibetans. In addition, they were amazed by how diligent the Tibetans were when it came to learning anything. The Tibetans seemed to be drawn to anything dangerous and also possessed a great deal of curiosity as well as the ability to invent solutions to problems with the materials at hand. In one instance, the Tibetans were able to make a portable rocket out of a simple wooden trough using homemade napalm. Homemade napalm. Homemade napalm, a small warhead, and gunpowder. One evening, a final, quote, launch, unquote, veered off target and disappeared over a distant hill. Suddenly, the faint lights that came from the climax molybdenum mine at the top of Fremont Pass went out. The Tibetans cheered. The next morning, one of the CIA officers went to the mine and offered to pay for interruption damages. The bill was $25,000. That is the story as I know it, and as I said before, anyone with the details about more details, please share them with us. My only comment on this last story is the cover story used by the U.S. government and the U.S. Army for its secret use of Camp Hale was for, quote, weapons testing, unquote. Can you imagine what the folks at the Climax mine must have been thinking when an explosive wooden trough landed on their building? Thank you very much. Okay.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank Carole first for all your hard work in organizing not just tonight's event, but also the memorial gathering day after tomorrow, which is so important and wonderful that we can do it. And to the Vail Symposium for giving us this opportunity to revisit the little-known story of Camp Hale and its connection to the Tibetan resistance. It's a pleasure to be reunited with Bruce, who first met my father 65 years ago, exactly around the time I was born in India, and who Ritu and I subsequently met and interviewed and befriended. Lovely to see you again, Bruce, and thank you for your wonderful presentation. Can we move to the next slide? Next slide. Next slide, please. It was in 1974. I was a 15-year-old schoolboy in a boarding school in Darjeeling in northern India. One morning, as I scanned the headlines of the daily newspaper pinned on the school bulletin board, my eyes were drawn to a small headline: Tibetan leader held in Nepal. The leader was my father. I was shocked and perplexed. Why had he been arrested? Why was his name being mentioned in connection with Khampa rebels? As far as I knew, my father worked for the Tibetan government in exile and had an office in New Delhi, which was why he was often absent from home. Next slide. A few days later, my mother came to visit me, distraught, and I learned the details of my father's arrest and the true nature of his work. It was only then that I discovered that he was a key figure in the Tibetan resistance and its main liaison with the CIA, which had supported the resistance from the late 1950s. Next. My father was the personal secretary and close confidant of Gyalpo Thundup, the elder brother of the Dalai Lama. They had met as students in the Chinese city of Nanking in the mid-1940s. That's Gyalpo Thundup on the left and my father standing in the back. Coming as they did from the same part of Tibet, they quickly became friends. In 1949, as communist forces were on the brink of victory in the Civil War, they fled to India via Hong Kong and set up base in Darjeeling, a town close to the border of Tibet. And next, please. Soon after their arrival in India, the People's Liberation Army invaded Tibet and quickly overran its meager defenses. Gyalpo Thundup, along with fellow emigres, actively actively publicize the situation in Tibet and work to rally international support. In Tibet, the representatives of the young Dalai Lama were forced to sign an agreement with China in which they ceded Tibet's sovereignty in exchange for control over its language, religion, and local government. By the mid-1950s, however, this fragile coexistence threatened to crack as the Chinese began to impose communist reforms in the outlying provinces of Kham and Amdo and targeted Buddhist monasteries. Next. By 1956, a full-blown revolt erupted in these provinces and a guerrilla campaign was launched against the Chinese. Next. News of the rebellion spread to Lhasa, where Andu Gompotashi, next slide please. Where Andu Gompotashi, in the middle here, a well-known Khampa trader living in the capital, started the underground organization Chushi Kangduk, which we've already heard about. Next slide, please. Gompotashi sent a small group of men to India to explore the possibilities of getting military support from foreign countries and organizations. They went to meet Galuthendup, who had already been approached by the CIA, which was keen to find ways of supporting the dissident Tibetan movement as part of its global anti-communist campaign. He put the representatives of Andu Gompotashi in touch with the CIA, which agreed to train a pilot group of 6 men. Can we have the next slide, please? And the video. Volume.
Early 57, probably in March of 57, approximate, when we got the cable from headquarters from Washington, which said that indeed there was going to be a Tibetan group coming to Saipan for training, without too much more information other than that they wanted across-the-board training, and that the people in the group were supposed to be able to communicate once they went back into Tibet, which meant, of course, clandestine radio. I was basically a somewhat junior officer at that time, but the more senior officers did not want the pleasure of working with the Tibetans for whatever reason. And it finally came to me that, okay, McCarthy, you're the guy that's going to handle this, the training aspects. And the only book that I could find in the library was Heinrich Harr's 7 Years in Tibet, which I obviously then consumed.
It was Roger McCarthy, who Carole and both Bruce mentioned. Following their training, the 6 men were parachuted back into Tibet. 2 men, Athar and Lotse, who we already talked about, were dropped close to Lhasa, where they made contact with Andu Gompotashi and successfully established radio communication with the CIA. The remaining 4 men were sent to Lithang in eastern Tibet, where fierce fighting was already underway. Only 1 man from this team, Gyatu Wongdu, survived and escaped back to India. The CIA, however, was happy with the outcome of this initial operation and decided to step up its support. A new training facility for the Tibetans was set up in the US. Next.
Of the areas that were possibilities in the United States, Colorado and Camp Hale was heads and shoulders above any other. It was the previous training site for the 10th, and was available. There was nothing there. So with the Department of Defense helping us along the way, we considered a few others, but that one was ideal. One that wasn't far from an airhead. It had all the training facilities and terrain that we wanted. It was secure. All we had to do was come up with a cover story of why it was being reactivated and what was going to go on there, particularly to cover the loud noises that would go with banging and shooting and demolitions and strange noises such as they might be. And we did that. We used a bit of atomic research as part of the cover story. And we got marvelous support out of the Department of Defense. They moved rapidly, totally, fully, and with great professionalism in accomplishing what was almost the impossible in a very brief period of time. It was, in fact, it was almost surprising to the Tibetans when they got in here to realize that they were in the States, and yet there was an area that looked very much like parts of COM looked like. And in fact, I think maybe more than one of them thought they had returned to COM rather than coming to the United States for training. The security aspects were only of real concern in the sense of what we were going to be using as a cover story for the local neighborhood, particularly there's a molybdenum mine up in the area. Leadville is an old mining town. But beyond that, there wasn't really much that we had to worry about. So that was also a blessing. And as I mentioned, the Army gave us all kinds of support, came in with dozers, construction, everything, and we basically located the camp in what had been the old barnyard area, the mule area, for the 10th Mountain, because it was already had plumbing capability and wells and water, which were the primary concerns.
Over the next, in 1958, Galutundub appointed my father to liaise between the resistance and the CIA. He was then trained by the CIA in spycraft and guerrilla warfare, first at a military installation in Virginia, and then at Camp Hale, where he arrived in early 1959 with the first group of 39 men. And Bruce, I think maybe that's when you first encountered my father, if I'm not mistaken.
It was.
Over the next few years, around 250 Tibetans were trained at Camp Hale. Change the slide, please. The Tibetans, they just loved the place with its high mountains, thick forests, and alpine meadows. It reminded them of their home, and they nicknamed the camp Dumra, the garden. The Americans who worked with them recalled their time with the Tibetans as the shining high point of their careers. Next, please. Video.
Hey, good morning. How are you? Here's the
Candid camera. Hello, Doc.
How are you?
Good to see you.
All right.
The meeting is over. You
Dr. Shivago. Okay, I'll go home. All right, turn around. All right.
Would you like coffee or tea or a soft drink?
What do you got here? What are you guys having?
could have called.
Well, we're going to come in and
Yeah,
sit down
true.
at the table and have a coffee flash. They went out and got sweet rolls. And
That's fine.
well, remember, we used to comment back and forth that we were grateful that we were working with the Tibetans instead of the group involved down in the Central America problem with the Bay of Pigs, that we were fortunate to be involved in a good program.
They are such an incredibly unique people. I don't think even ourselves, even within the agency and perhaps not even within our own group, do we realize just how incredibly unique they are.
They still believe their religion.
Oh, yeah. But I've never met any people like them. I never will.
In 1992, my partner Ritu and I spent a few months with my parents in Dharamsala, the exile capital of the Tibetan diaspora. At the time, my father was engaged in writing a detailed account of the Tibetan resistance, a monumental task that would occupy him until his death. Next slide, please. And the next one. A meticulous archivist, he now shared with us his collection of photographs, documents, maps, and his own exhaustive notebooks and diaries. Next, please. My father's, this is actually a letter from someone, the CIA case officer in India to my father. My father's code name was Larry. And as you can see, some of the the normal day-to-day activities of espionage and secret undercover operations like this was quite mundane. A lot of it had to do with finances and accounting. Next. My father's archive of the resistance contains a handbook of guerrilla warfare, handwritten in Tibetan with carefully drawn illustrations that transmits what the Tibetans learned at Camp Hale. Next. Next. And again. Of the many incredible stories we heard from my father, accounts of the clandestine air missions into Tibet were particularly fascinating. Next. These are the headshots of all the team members who were parachuted back into Tibet. So between 1957 and 1961, 8 Tibetan radio teams trained by the CIA, first in Saipan and then at Camp Hale, were parachuted by the CIA into Tibet to make contact with resistance groups still fighting the Chinese. They were to organize these ragtag forces into modern guerrilla armies and coordinate arms drops for them from the CIA. Next. For the Tibetans, coming as they did from a world where even automobiles were non-existent, the air missions were a leap of faith into the modern world. In the space of a few months, they made the transition from fighting on horseback to jumping out of aeroplanes. Next. Please.
So they gala and reduces in the sinola tanju. Lansan sinot not the sal mapo ni lumbel and mapo sadi gala lansan sinot dance. Then when you reduce it, when you my young egg, Michuko, Togo young edge, or go lang edge, or what that could reduce. Then on the robot on the conservative punch at the dead, or not the chicken or said. And I'm on the path of that, Baba love. And I was teaching it, and when you pay out the tone on the mapayade, mother said to get your mother, said to go your mother, Matonoma Pogoya, Tobo you, Maniti woman. What didn't I when you need to tell my gossip, my jump chain, when you told them, my use, and in your Kobatai or Koba Quatetas and Ross, Toba Cassated and Merl and Ross, then when you did Shugulama, and the Toba Cavato and call it and the tongue when you do college show you or Tovalatan, college Jokatu Kuntucha. That Nankala Chunichi, Java Nanga, Palankala Jayaji, or Koti Jaya, the Lusha, or what Jaya. Can't do Tobe short of attaching me. And then the Tobo when you paralachi, me touch it to my Johnsala, and I'm not dear potos. Therefore, do not Samajum Wallajos.
So that's Ata Nobu, who was a member of the first radio team parachuted into Tibet, and probably, the first Tibetan ever to be parachuted inside Tibet, or perhaps anyone ever to be parachuted inside Tibet. Next slide, please. So, although some of the teams successfully linked up with the groups on the ground and were able to coordinate a number of arms drops from the CIA, the missions mostly ended in tragedy. The Chinese overwhelmed the resistance groups, who were often gathered in large encampments with their families and animals, attacking them from the air and pounding them with heavy artillery. The majority of the Camp Hale teams were either killed in action or died consuming their CIA-provided cyanide capsules. Only a few made it back to India, and a handful were captured by the Chinese. Next, please. So I'm going to go a little fast because I think we're running out of time. So let's just move on. So this is the Mustang resistance force in northern Nepal, which was the next phase of the operation, which the CIA also funded. And it was around 2,000 Tibetans eventually ended up in Mustang. And a number of Camp Hale trainees were sent to Mustang to train these fighters. Next slide, please. The CIA also dropped arms to them. And the Mustang Resistance Force continued until, the camp itself continued until 1974, when it was shut down by the Nepalese army after a tense standoff. But the CIA's involvement in the Tibetan resistance, ended in the late 60s, at a time when America and China were seeking a closer relationship, and the Mustang Resistance Organization had kind of outlived its usefulness. So it came as a shock to the Tibetans when the CIA announced that they were going to pull out of it. But my father, retrospectively, he always says, at least the CIA came to our help when no one else did. So in that sense, we should be grateful to them. So shall we just move on a bit? So that's my father there. That's Gyatu Wongdu, who was the last commander of Mustang, who was among the first group of people trained in Saipan, parachuted into Tibet, escaped from Tibet, came back into India, and then headed the Mustang Resistance Force, and tragically was killed by the Nepalese army in an ambush when they closed down the camp. Next. So here's a photo of the Mustang soldiers with their CIA-provided armaments. Next. So typically, raiding parties went from Mustang into Tibet, because Mustang is an area in northern Nepal, some of you may have been there, that juts into Tibet, very close to the Lhasa-Xinjiang highway, which was then being built. So raiding parties used to go onto the Lhasa-Xinjiang highway and conduct ambushes. And one such ambush, which I don't know if Roger mentioned it, turned out to be an incredible intelligence haul. And let's move on to the next slide. So Ken will tell us more about this.
The Tibetan document raid, in a sense, of course, was one of the greatest intelligence hauls in the history of the agency. It's called the document raid, of course, but that wasn't its intention purposes. The purpose of all the raids that were done at that time and that the Mustang operations were to cut operations along the Xinjiang-Lhasa highway. And so happened that one night when they conducted an ambush, there was an army officer carrying a knapsack full of documents. The Tibetans fortunately recognized what was there. They'd been also trained to recognize that this is how you get intelligence. You try and find whatever you can in this. And that fortuitously, the ambush that they laid was a Chinese officer had been carrying a knapsack full of documents, highly classified documents. He was a political commissar, so he had not commissar, but a political officer, whatever it was. And it was a gamma. It was a really rich gold mine of intelligence. Obviously, the intelligence community devoured them. Everybody was fascinated. The Pentagon was interested in the OB figures, the State Department, and the ideological split. All of the town's economists were interested in the state of the Chinese economy, and here you had these things. And they got back, and Mr. Dulles took these to I suppose it must have been a National Security Council meeting, and here was sort of, in a way, it's you don't evaluate human lives in terms of return, but here was an actual a product of these operations that could be shown, a demonstrable one, a benefit to the U.S. government. So that was of great help as far as maintaining support for these kind of operations.
Okay, let's move on. So basically, after the CIA closed down the resistance and the Nepalese army kind of shut it down, my father and 6 Tibetan resistance leaders were arrested by the Nepalese army and sentenced to life imprisonment. But after serving nearly 7 years in prison in Nepal, the king granted them amnesty and they were released. Can we have the next slide? And that's a photo of them when they were released. And again, so I'll just end with a quote from my father. This was from an interview we did just before he passed away in 1999 when we were making the film. So please, yeah.
Tangatu sunutade kutu rishiki aka tangatu chumasu rasulotan chini zatundal zane panto chumasu de juba kenya yunsegriti yine ngarati 토마네 디 툰달라련 타바도 등을 두순다데 다 미리지기 타둔지야라 무투니 지고야기 마다지기 까부치니 지마트발 납사 샤고야 그요 말이야 다 타바도 담을리기 로주토 간단 무투니 타둔지야 타바도 타둔 무투니 지그래 다뭐 보당을 두순다 디쇼를 자갈라니 무투지 다 디도 지바기 니랴 무투니 탄다보다 쉬는 탄다 자나 디가가 무투니 로주지로와 대동아 전하니 지기 파마트나 네 개일게 돈다를 주비는 그 선슈티 배미막 돈다 선슈케니 가가 로술로 다르다 다 들으라들 말해 그나 가도 저도 시가도 그랬어 매일 돈다랬어 나도 너 중국으로다 양지와도 진행하도 파마 빈잘 따도 지고 가도 그 빈잘 탔다도 저 지나 되고 말다 자와네 나도 매일 돈다 나도 로술로 다지 그랬어 나도 자와네 들이 시험하고 대쇼를 가도 마도 콘처도 사이자셔서 계시 또스 가도 슈네 두순다 단트비나 수를 대고 그랬어 나가주대 가져놨어 나도 배샤 돈다를 어치기요 저도 구티를 왔어 나도 배샤 돈다를 했어 나도 미래가 돈다를 했어 가져디 가를 했어 저 칼을 돈트야시라 했어 가져시라 않았어 나도 나서를 다 사이자 사했으니 나도 나 춘자를 이제 미래가 출라서지 되게 산을 소냐 야마르바 나도 배를 또 가려 유샤베 살 추샤베 그래 내게 로스로 다 주래 대다 구속이 선슈티 이제는 시라리 다 아래 로치바디 구슬로 야오케니 로치베이나다 그러가지고 배주진이 로치베이나다 간단 가주디 배주진이 가주기 돈다를 판독해요 나도 그러 제바들 나 시다기 로파 마주 가서 나도 토마 주디 저도 로카데지가 로카데지 계속 맞지는 가지고 가르치고서 이차는 김에 카기 턴에 어러치기 나도 로슈기 있으면도 저로도 주바자 사면도 다 저도 내주를 때마서 뒤쳐서 심어도 나도 이 턴에 저도 그两个 키마 시야야 말봐 말씀을 그냥 고무주 때나 가서 쉬고 인생도 들어가 수익 가서 고무 잘 때나 가 여기 가서 가서 뒤 내가 지을 수도 빼셔도야 말이 선쇼는 치라주 두라서로 다 지거지 로다 지가 두도 빼셔야 말이 고수요 말이 잘라요 말이 뒤뉴고 우리 빼셔야 말이 대에서 구두 고고 때문에 있나다 구두 폐지지기 있나다 나라디 야구 중수는 생기도 달라 봐야디 안에 구두 나서 제버디 뒤 인내 단다 시작 구두 tunjunte barwa denzo nga chenani sidagi ta kudu yushawari ganchunte tsima su sida suyake ayo sangto daga nga su tuntal panto yawari peke laki yuname kandar yamil kati jobare jawari denzo ngaro gelki sangsu gelki nyanyo tane shuna di sampan chegoyake mandu sangto.
Thank you very much.
I know we've run out of time, I've been told so. So I won't say much, I will not read what I have prepared for you this evening. I just want to take over from what Lama Tsering said, my father-in-law. I met him, I think, in '86. He was a very diligent, very sincere man. He was 6 years after he'd come out of prison, worked daily on getting his materials together, writing the history of the Tibetan resistance. And that's how our journey, we were filmmakers already in the Bay Area at the time, Tenzing and myself. That's how our journey started about 40 years ago, trying to tell the story of the Tibetan resistance and its connection to the CIA. And we made, in this long time, a film that showed, on PBS, on the BBC. It actually showed at the Telluride Mountain Film Festival and won the best historical documentary there. And I think that's where Bob, the local journalist, first saw it and heard about Camp Hale. So, many things have happened. And we also started the journey of putting the archive together. We have done exhibitions around the world, taking all of these materials from place to place, and we hope to continue doing that, and we are planning to bring it to the US because I feel like together we need to keep this story alive, keep it burning, keep the younger generations knowing what happened, and that's what we are out to do, and I think today we've really managed to do that. And if you are there on this journey with us, all of you who are here today are introduced to this matter for the first time, I hope you will take it to your friends and move it along. So that's all I'd like to say and just close it. Thank you. Us with some time for question and answers, right?
We do.
Yeah?
Thank you. And I know that there's interest in hearing the rest of what you had to say as well.
Actually, the other thing I can talk about is my impressions. I think if I look over these 40 years, my first impression, as I mentioned, is of course of Lamo Tsering, my father-in-law. Sorry? The slides. There are slides. You can show the slides. Yeah. Okay, so that's Tenzing and I starting our research in the early days. Filming. I think there's an earlier slide that we've missed, have we? Yes. Looking at all the research materials, all the photographs that Tenzing's father is sharing with us. So he kind of brought us into it. In a sense, he kind of indoctrinated us at a very young age, and we've kind of continued to shoulder that responsibility. And after he passed away, his archives have come to are with us. And so it's really a great responsibility. That's how we see it. His archives, our archives, and we continue to gather archival materials and try to tell the story. Next one. I think this is, we can move on. I think Tenzing has covered this area. Yeah, I think I want to talk about so we met first we met a lot of Tibetans. They were mostly in India and Nepal. And it was the first time, they had never told their story before. It was the first time because Tenzing's father had kind of given the nod to them that it was okay to tell the story. So they'd never spoken about this chapter before. And as Carole mentioned, this was an arrested history. They hadn't spoken about it. So it was very emotional for them. It was also very interesting to see how much they retained in their head because they were from a period where there was nothing written. So they could tell us about the phases of the moon, which morning, what happened, what they ate. And the interviews sometimes went on for many days. One of the first people we interviewed, he said to us, Tenzing asked, that's not him. Next slide, please. No. It doesn't matter. He was a Tibetan monk. He had been a Tibetan monk. He'd given up his vows for a period. His name was Baba Yeshe. He was kind of very, notorious leader of the Mustang force. And what he said to Tenzing the first day was, Tenzing asked him the question, so where were you born and how did you get here? He spoke for a whole day in an accent that was very hard to understand. And at 5 o'clock, he said, come back tomorrow. So we spent 3 whole days with them. And our interviews were very in-depth. We realized their archival value. We also realized that they were aging, so it was very, very important for us to actually make a film and to move on with the process. But what I think I'm left with, if I think about just the impressions and not going into more detail, is the fact that they really believed in their cause. It was their homeland, it was their religion, it was their culture, their way of life that was threatened. And as Tenzing's father said, they would do anything. They're willing to sacrifice their lives. And that was really a shock. And by the time we had met them, they hadn't spoken about this episode for so long. And we realized there was pain. They were very happy what they did, but there was also pain because they hadn't managed to fight. They hadn't managed to succeed in fighting the Chinese. So there was, of course, pain there. And, it was very, very emotional. I think that's what I would say. Meeting the Americans is a whole different story. So I think we had already met Bruce when we were in college at Berkeley, because we didn't speak about this episode, but he was a friend of Tenzing's father. He came to meet us. And so we had a brief meeting. We didn't talk about any of this. The first person we met many years later was Ken Knaus, who we've seen in the interview, who later on went and wrote a major book about this. And Ken was a charming gentleman. He was at Harvard Kennedy School. He was working there. He took us out for a very nice lunch. And then he said, much as I'd like to help you, I cannot be part of your documentary because I'm still working for the agency. So that was kind of interesting for us to actually, who do we speak to? Then we were told by a journalist friend that there's an association of former intelligence officers in DC. There's a telephone number you can call and they can help you. So we made the call. We said, there's a guy called Mac that we hear a lot about, and he's been part of the Tibet operation. Do you have any idea where he might be? They immediately knew who he was. They gave us Roger McCarthy's number. He was working at a casino in Las Vegas. He was the head of security. And when Tenzin called him and said, I'm Larry's son, he said, come on over, come on this weekend. So Tenzin and I actually flew over, not knowing what to expect of Roger, sort of going to a casino. On the weekend, he had bought all these sodas and bought lots of chips, and then he just kind of got us into this dark space. And then he said, before we could speak, he said, what happened? What happened to, this person? What happened to that mission? He had been taken off the Tibet story, the Tibet episode, because he had become too attached to the Tibetans. So he didn't know what had happened because, there's compartmentalization. You don't know once you moved out from the Tibet episode what happened to the Tibetans. He was so emotional, and he was like, we let them down. And he also cared so much about the Tibetans. And I think for us, that was such a weird thing. We were, had been students at Berkeley. Everything we know about the CIA, doesn't fill you. You just didn't expect that kind of humanity, I guess, and that kind of care from a CIA operative. And I think that's the other impression we had of all the main CIA people we've met, Bruce, Ken, Roger, who we interviewed in great depth, is that they cared so much. And I think that's been very, very interesting learning for us. So on one side, we had the Tibetans who were willing to sacrifice everything, and on the other side, we had some CIA officers, case officers, I should say, Bruce, who really did care and are still care and have written about it. And, I think it's been a very important part of our life. And I think that's why we continue to do this. So,
Bless your heart.
No, thank you. So I think that's the main impression, is you kind of go into a story not knowing what to expect, and what you find is really not at all what you expect. And I think that is part of the storytelling we do, the kind of research we've been doing, is we're always surprised. And I think that's the beauty of the kind of work we are privileged to do, and we continue to do. So I think I'll leave it there.
We do have time for questions. Online, please use the Q&A feature in your Zoom dashboard, and we'll take some questions here in the room. But our honored guests, I think, would like to share some remarks before we have questions.
Can I say a few words?
Please. Can I give you the mic?
Can I go to say a few words? First of all, I feel, is it a dream? Because for the last 6-7 decades, we have not heard about the unsung heroes' deeds, their dedication, and their sacrifice. We have not seen such photos. We have not seen such words about them. They sacrifice their life for the country, and then we don't have the National Mourning Day. The question comes, something is lacking in our morality, because these people sacrifice their life for the country. You see, they mentioned Adung Gobotashi. He was the main organizer of the Chishigoru. He was the leader. His aim was to defend the country and give security for His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. CIA wanted to help very much because they don't like the expansion of communism. You see, Tibet is located very strategically in Asia, between two giant nations, that's India and China. So CIA definitely wanted to help. And so now mentioned, Jalutendo, His Holiness Dalai Lama's elder brother and his father, they really played a great role because CIA doesn't have any contact in Tibet those years. So through them, they contacted, they did everything. So his father and Jalutendo did a great service for the nation. Then the question comes, why CIA helped? Did it serve any purpose? Why the Chijiguru organization was organized? What was the goal? Did they serve the purpose or did they achieve the goal? These are questions. I definitely say that CIA helps encourage Tibetan fighters very much because I was 16 years old in the guerrilla camp. I remember the CIA's plane 2 times came. At night, they shoot it by the guns, they dropped guns and ammunitions. So Atha, the mission was his wireless, he sent his message to US CIA, and accordingly they planned. So the main purpose it came, security of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Because Chinese intention was that they wanted to kidnap His Holiness the Dalai Lama. See, then Chijiguru's main aim was to give a protection to His Holiness and protect him. Then on 1959, March 10, the Chinese told His Holiness Dalai Lama, you come in the camp, Chinese military camp. We want to show you a Dhamma, but don't bring any security guard. See, they made the biggest mistake. I think, oh God, something did happen because His Holiness maximum takes 5-6 people. They don't have rifles. What can they do in the Chinese camp with rifles? 5-6. But Chinese told that you don't bring any security guard. The Tibetans got suspicion and they rose against the Chinese and the Nobulinga, the summer palace of His Holiness was escorted, but then there was no possible of His Holiness staying back. And then slowly we had contact. That time there was no telephone, there is no such thing, communications. But I remember brave people go at night from military camp to the Nobulinga and they come back. They are kinetic, okay, you come this way, you come that way, but we are ready to protect. My uncle who brought me from Tibet, from my camp, was killed there very much. He got bullet here and killed there. Many in my group, about 40 in my groups, 10 of them were killed there. So anyway, at March, at night, 11 o'clock, His Holiness with, layman dress with a gun, spectacle, he came out, he was able to disguise the people. The other side of the river was received by my brother, Tembataji. His name was in his first book. So that way, 7 days it takes His Holiness from this river, crossing river, to the Indian border. The Chinese camp, biggest camp was there in the local itself. So Jalutendu's book tells that all those Chinese camps in those areas were Chijiguru were able to finish them, destroy them. Only one camp was left, Chinese camp. So the Chijiguru, they're showing some part of that, were able to escort His Holiness safely, leisurely, comfortably to Indian border. So the main communication, the main arrangement was done by his father and Jalutendu. But Khombas did the physical protection and physically, escort. That way, what I'm saying, the CIA helped a lot. achieve the goal, I think. Combat fighting organization, they achieved the goal. The goal was His Holiness Dalai Lama was safely got to India. So that day, the Chinese military commander in Lhasa, the capital city of Tibet, told to this China, Mao Zedong, we have crashed the rebellions. We have big victory. Then Mao Zedong asked the Chinese commander, where is the Dalai Lama? And then he said, he has escaped to India. Then he said, Mao Zedong, you are not winner, you are big loser. So that way, we Hombas been able to bring His Holiness to India, and China was big loser. That's what Mao Zedong said to his commander. So that way, we are very proud to achieve that. But I have a question, Bruce Walker. In spite of his helping them, training them, and what is his impression about, his personal impression about their dedication or their service? One thing. Second question is that we Tibetans in the exile community do not have a system of memorying them. We have the memorial days. Even the president goes to the graveyard to throw flowers and remember their great service to the nation. But we Tibetans don't have that. See, Andrew Govatrashi came to India with a bullet wounded, taken to London, 59. He was operated, come back, he died there. Nobody remembers that. Does anybody remember that? How he was hero. How much he sacrificed. But we Tibetans don't remember it at all. So my question is, we Tibetans are lacking something morally, not remembering them. So that's why I'm saying that today it's like for me, it's a dream. You see, seeing that, hearing that, after 6-7 decades. So this teacher, Bruce Walker, what's your impression about those heroes and those brave sacrifices, your personal impression? Second thing, are we Tibetans lacking so morally, not remembering them, not having a memorial days? So two things. Thank you very much.
Go for it.
I had a quick question. I wanted to understand why they were persecuted by the Nepalese army, the Mustangs, after all their sacrifice.
Why were they persecuted in Nepal? That's a very good question. Tenzing? Can you, the question is, I think you're the best person to answer. Okay. Why was the Nepalese government, why after so long did they finally go after the Tibetans?
Yes, so the Nepalese government knew about the Mustang Resistance Force. Of course they did. But, at that time, the Americans were quite influential in Nepal. So, and China wasn't very influential in Nepal. So they just pretended they didn't see what was happening in Mustang. But by 1974, the Americans had pulled out of Mustang. It had already been about 3 or 4 years that they had pulled out. And China was gaining influence in Nepal. And I think China then really kind of, leaned heavily on the Nepalese government and said, this is something you have to stop now. So that's when they moved in. And so that was
All right, so we'll welcome you to come and ask your questions of the panel if you'd like. I'd like to thank our distinguished guests here with us this evening and our incredible panel. Thank you for sharing this history and this important story with our community. Would you join me in a round of applause?